There we go. So again, welcome to everyone. It's good to have you here. I want to introduce our speaker for today's Synod Connect, although I know that most of you know Faith very, very well. And then we will continue with a meditation that was written for Holy Week and around grief. And then we'll turn it to Faith for her sharing today. It's a real pleasure, Deacon Dr. Faith Nostbakken, to welcome you to this time of presentation and conversation. Faith is a registered spiritual director at the Providence Renewal Center in Edmonton, and she is a deacon of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. She has received a certificate in spiritual direction, has a master's of theological studies and a PhD in English literature. And she is currently working on another degree, a Doctor of Ministry in Saskatoon or through Saskatoon. In addition to many other things and gifts that Faith brings, she also serves as our Synod's ecumenical officer in the north part of our Synod, and is in that capacity very involved in ecumenical dialogue and interfaith connections, and very much appreciate the gifts that Faith brings on my behalf and on behalf of the Synod as well. Faith, welcome to you. It's good to have you here. Thanks for sharing with us today. We look forward to your presentation and to time of conversation with you. Welcome. Morning, Pastor Anna. Welcome to you. We want to continue then with a meditation today as we continue our time together. This meditation I saw on Facebook earlier in the week. It was written for Holy Week. There is a group of pastors and others who are participating in a grief lectionary group. And one of the facilitators of this group then put together this meditation based on the Passion story according to Matthew. And I thought, given today's conversation around grief and loss, that this would be appropriate for us. So I invite you into a time of reflection together, if a time of reception, a time of listening to this meditation and engaging in the meditation. If you're comfortable to close your eyes, or if you prefer to turn your camera off, please feel free to do what's comfortable for you, and to have a posture of reception and listening as we enter together in this meditation. This was written by Pastor Colette Brody-Grund, and it comes in two parts. The first is gathering your grief before Holy Week, and the second part, a blessing for those who grieve during Holy Week. And as I read through the meditation, I will say those words again, but we will begin with gathering your grief before Holy Week. Let's take a moment for some silence as we enter together into this meditation. Gathering your grief before Holy Week. As we remember Jesus' suffering and death, we remember also the roads of suffering we have walked, the crosses we have borne, and the deaths we have witnessed. We have been changed by these griefs, and they change the way we bear witness to the suffering of God in Jesus. So let us gather our grief as we contemplate the greatest grief of God, the suffering and death of God's own Son. Gather around you your enemies, your betrayers, the forces of evil you have felt palpably. Gather your memory of all the last things, the Last Supper, the last holiday, the last argument, the last words. Remember all the warning signs, those which were clearly saying something is wrong, death is coming, and those you only understood later, after grief had come in hindsight. Remember the prayers you cried, along with tears, that this grief might be avoided, that your loved one might be healed, that your time of trial never come. Remember those who prayed with you, and those who said they'd pray but really didn't. Let the betrayals come back to you, those who've kissed you then turned on you, those who've been unfaithful to you, to the church, to their calling, to their God, those who could have done something and didn't. Recall the times you have been the betrayer, when your mouth should have praised but mocked instead, when you pretended not to know, not to be, when you decided not to speak for the sake of your own comfort. Remember the faces that turned to you in disappointment, stricken by your failure. Remember who walked with you, who wept beside you, who cried out to God for you. Remember to include Jesus among them. Remember when the sun's light failed, when you sighed and gave up. Remember when your life was torn open like a flimsy curtain. And remember how all this connects you to Christ. The suffering, the weeping, the surrender. Finally, remember that at the beginning and in the tomb, God's new creation began in darkness. A blessing for those who grieve during Holy Week. When you walk through the valley of Jesus' death, shadows of your own grief will certainly arise. Do not be afraid. Weep with Jesus. Wait. Pray. Bear witness to a God who doesn't avoid suffering, neither yours nor theirs, and doesn't glorify it, and definitely doesn't need it to do their work. Not in Jesus, not in the church, not in you. And yet, takes all that suffering in spite of evil and works in darkness and creates in tombs and tears and half the veil to prepare for what comes next. To prepare for what comes next, which is always life. Amen. Again, welcome everyone. It's good to gather again. Deacon Dr. Faith Nostbakken, welcome. We appreciate your time and your sharing with us today, and we'll turn this time over to you. Thank you, Faith.
Thank you, Bishop Larry. It's a privilege to be with you today and to share on this topic, which I think is always timely, but especially in these times. And I will have a PowerPoint that I'll get to in just a moment that will hopefully aid in what I have to say and give some visuals to go with it. So I want to begin by saying that I think grief is always a relevant topic, because there are always some among us in whatever circles we travel who are experiencing loss in one form or another. But I think we are at a very critical time, both locally and globally, having lived through such turmoil with COVID-19 for over 2 years now. And the truth is that we won't go back to the way we were. We will find our way into a new normal. But even acknowledging that comes with costs for each one of us. And nobody has been able to escape loss in a whole variety of ways during this pandemic. For many, the losses have been profound. And for some, the losses they would have had to face, even in normal circumstances, have become more painful or devastating because they have not had access to the natural grieving pathways and human connections that might have been present without all the social restrictions that we have had to observe. I want to, just as a personal context, just before the pandemic began, and I will remember this as the beginning of the pandemic, I took part in a grief workshop sponsored in part by the University of Calgary social work program. And that was the last public thing I did before everything shut down. And then somewhat later, though still early in the pandemic, I trained to become a grief recovery specialist in with an organization known as the Grief Recovery Institute. That institute is based in the United States, though their programs reach far beyond the American borders. And from these two events, and from my own experience, both as a spiritual director and as someone who has faced a lot of losses in my adult life as a result of chronic illness, I know that grief runs deep right now in our churches, in our communities, in our families, in ourselves, whether we are pastoral caregivers or simply human beings living in relationship with one another and with our world. What I propose to do is to offer a few definitions of grief, name what the Grief Recovery Institute identifies as some of the social myths around grief, and say a bit about my own experience working both with the Grief Recovery Program and also outside of it as a spiritual director, listening to people as they journey through the challenges of these last few years in particular. And after I've given my presentation, I'll open the time up for questions and sharing among you. And so I'm going to move into a PowerPoint slide right now and begin with how we can define grief, because I think that's kind of important to how we understand it. And I like the definitions offered by John James and Russell Friedman of the Grief Recovery Program and in their handbook. They are founders of the Grief Recovery Institute. In acknowledging that grief is what they say the most neglected and misunderstood experience, often both by the grievers and those around them, they nevertheless describe it as the normal and natural reaction to any kind of loss. I add to that Kenneth Hawk, a grief minister, adds a third N to this: normal, natural, and necessary. We need to grieve because it is a normal and natural response to any kind of loss, and because it is necessary. Choosing not to grieve only means that grief lasts longer and may cause us even greater pain. So here is a second way of defining or naming grief besides natural, normal, and necessary, to speak of it as the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern or behavior. This is a very broad definition, and for that reason, I think it is very useful because it helps us acknowledge and validate our own feelings when any of our familiar patterns of behavior end or change, and to recognize that such end or change is experienced as a loss. In loss, there can be conflicting feelings. For example, if a loved one has died, but that loved one suffered for a long time and needed significant care from you or others, you may feel deep sadness, but also relief that the person's suffering is now over, and so are your caregiving responsibilities. Or if you have experienced a divorce, you may have positive feelings about no longer being in daily relationships of conflict, but you may also be experiencing fear about your own security or what the future holds. Death and divorce are two of the main sources of grief, but there are other causes as well. The loss of a pet may seem minor, but can be a real loss for as part of a family member in a way. Likewise, changes in health, retirement, job loss, an empty nest. Even experiences that we perceive to be and recognize as positive can have grief associated with them. Marriage is not only a promise of a life spent together with someone we love, but it is a loss of independence. Likewise, the birth of a child is a great celebration, but it is also, again, a loss of freedom and independence that will last for years to come. Graduation honors the achievement of a time in school, but it ends relationships, friendships, and patterns of behavior. Sometimes we might almost feel guilty for acknowledging the element of loss in an experience that involves celebration or achievement, but conflicting feelings or mixed feelings are normal and natural. It is good and healthy to be able to recognize and acknowledge when an end or change in a familiar behavior evokes conflicting feelings. And it is good and healthy to recognize and acknowledge that grief is natural, normal, and necessary as a response to any kind of loss. And now think of these last 2 years, given this understanding of grief. Who hasn't experienced grief, whether we have named it as that or not? Life as we knew it changed over 2 years ago. Normal began to look very different. And we lost some familiar patterns of behavior, from the way we meet one another or buy groceries, or perhaps from the way we draw an income, if our jobs have been lost or changed, to the dreams we have for our children or ourselves in the near or distant future, certainly to the way we have come together or haven't come together for worship. And if anyone has lost a loved one during this period, the loss may be doubly hard because we can't gather in the same way around rituals of mourning. So I believe COVID is a huge source of grief, individually, communally, and globally. Everyone will have their own story about what that means for them. And I just invite you to reflect for a moment about your experience. What has gone missing from your life in the past 2 years? What might return again? And what might not? Because we had hopes, dreams, and expectations for these 2 years that will simply never be fulfilled on the timeline we had planned. And as you think about that, about your experience of these last 2 years, I want you to acknowledge that grief can take a lot from us emotionally, psychologically, physically, mentally, and spiritually. It is important to take our time and to be kind to ourselves or to those whom we know who are grieving. Self-care is vital, and it will look different for each griever because we are unique in every aspect, including in how we experience loss and respond to our griefs. Grief is necessary, but from this perspective of the Grief Recovery Institute, it is one of the most neglected and misunderstood processes, and there are a lot of social assumptions that get in the way. John James and Russell Freeman call these myths. They are learned by society at large or expressed by people around us in ways that don't help us grieve well, by which I mean grieving honestly. And so here are some of the myths that we might encounter. Don't feel bad. But the fact is, you do feel bad. So it just asks you to lie to yourself and to suppress your feelings. Second, replace the loss. Nothing can replace what you have lost. Even if it's a pet and a new pet comes into your home after the one you had died, the new one is a new relationship. It doesn't replace your relationship with the former pet. New ways of worship may broaden our reach into the community, but that does not replace the familiar ways we were used to before COVID began. Third, time heals all wounds. Time itself doesn't heal wounds. It's what we do with the time that matters. Repressing feelings of grief over time will not help us heal from our losses. Fourth, be strong for others. Depending on where we are in a community or family of grievers, we may think we need to be strong for them by repressing our own feelings and needs. But this doesn't help us grieve at all. And it might not be the example others need to follow. And fifth, keep busy. This will not complete the pain of loss. It will only keep the pain buried. It is a distraction that doesn't address the grief, but only puts it on hold and leaves all the emotions unaddressed. These are myths, that is, they are sources of misinformation. And there are so many more than the ones I have mentioned. They don't help us as people grieve. They try to bury, ignore, or disguise it. What people experience in grief, and that is likely all of us right now, are really often looking for, seeking, is not a way to avoid grief, but a way to experience comfort and acceptance in the midst of grief. And as the Grief Recovery Program suggests by its very name, what we want and need in our honest experience and expression of grief is some way to recover. That word may raise a few eyebrows or make you restless as you think about it. And I admit that was how I responded when I first saw those two words put together, grief and recovery. As if all we had to do was adjust to our losses and forget who or what has gone missing from our lives. But grief recovery isn't that. Grief recovery is a program and a process with a series of steps that are taken together over a series of sessions or weeks that gives us a way to address some of our losses, express them, name them, acknowledge them, so that we are not simply stuck in the nameless, comfortless state of ungrieved grief that can drain the energy out of our lives. The Grief Recovery Handbook puts it this way. Recovery means feeling better. Recovery means claiming your circumstances instead of your circumstances claiming you and your happiness. Recovery is finding new meaning for living. It is being able to enjoy fond memories without having them precipitate painful feelings of regret or remorse. Recovery is acknowledging that it is perfectly all right to feel sad from time to time and to talk about those feelings, no matter how those around you react. Recovery is being able to forgive others when they say or do things that you know are based in their lack of knowledge about grief. Recovery is one day realizing that your ability to talk about the losses you've experienced is indeed normal and healthy. And most important from the standpoint of this program, recovery means acquiring the skills that allow us to deal with loss directly. The grief recovery method, as it's called, is not a support group, and it is not therapy. It is what's considered an action-based education program that gives people both language and tools to acknowledge, feel, and process their grief. The main program can be done in a group setting or one-on-one, either way guided by a trained grief recovery specialist, with readings and small assignments to do between sessions, including, and I think this is a kind of significant one, taking a long look at your history of losses and their cumulative effect, and identifying the intensity of some of those key loss experiences that have happened over a lifetime. The program is designed to take place once a week over 8 weeks, and it can be done in person or online. There's also a separate program using some of the same principles to help children with loss by guiding adults through processes that can help children grieve. And goodness knows that children have experienced a lot of disruption to their lives in the past few years, with a lot of grief, perhaps not even named, identified, or given room to be acknowledged and addressed. The grief recovery program is not faith-based. It is not limited to people of faith, but I would say it is faith-friendly. There is nothing about it that prevents you from responding from a faith perspective. Having said that much about the grief recovery program, I will add that for me, it is one approach to dealing with grief, one that I've more recently gotten involved in, one that equips people to learn how to address different experiences of grief as they arrive, once those concepts have been learned and applied. And so in a sense, you go through the process once and you learn those tools, and then you can use them in other awarenesses of different experiences of grief that arrive. I'll also say that during this pandemic, I have given some workshops on grief that draw on some of the useful language from the grief recovery program, but in which I deliberately access some of the explicit faith-based assumptions that include what it means to seek comfort and to find hope in and through our Christian faith. And so the format that I have used, as I put it here on this slide, is to look at definitions of grief, to look at experiencing loss, and then what it means to seek comfort, and then finally what it means to find hope. And particularly emphasizing in that last section, the fact that we are Easter people. And as we come through Holy Week, moving our way towards that, it is a great reminder that in all of our experiences of grief, we are people of hope. And I will also say that I have been in many one-on-one spiritual direction sessions where the greatest gift is simply to give people permission to name their losses, to tell their stories, sometimes more than once, and to experience compassionate listening as a source of healing. Grief is about acknowledging losses. It is also about moving towards healing. It is a process, and that process is unique for each person, even if some of the losses are the same. COVID has put a lot of us in the same circumstances, but each of us will be experiencing the grief of this experience differently. For instance, perhaps unlike for many of you, there have been some real gifts in COVID for me, because I live with chronic illness, and the fact that I have suddenly been able to do all the things I do, spiritual direction, workshops, presentations such as this, retreats, my doctoral studies, all of that from home and online has meant much more stability in my health and a higher level of functioning. For me, in fact, therefore, there will be some obvious losses when I have to start trying to function more away from my home than in it, if and when we start meeting together more often for our shared events and activities. Many of you will not have my perspective because all of you will have had different challenges and different experiences of what has been lost over these past 2+ years. However, we can benefit from some of the same tools or skills to address our grief. We can benefit from some of the same language that helps us identify our griefs. We can benefit from some of the same processes, and we can benefit from taking time to do the work alone, together, in supportive contexts, and sometimes with the guidance of someone who has had training and experience in one or more approaches to the grieving process. It has been my purpose in this short presentation to introduce you to language and a way of understanding the pandemic as an experience of grief, and to touch on some aspects of the grief recovery method, to look at possibly some of the other losses that you are experiencing right now, or that you have in the past that you may not have thought about as losses. Also, I wanted to speak of supports and opportunities for addressing the reality of grief for all of us in and around these last few years, and what other variables have influenced and affected your lives and mine, where we find ourselves today and in our recent history. And I share with you a couple of quotations that come from a lovely little book by Paula D'Arcy, whom I know personally, and just has a great deal to offer from the perspective of grief. She says, healing asks us to give up our insistence that life will unfold in a certain way. There is no way life should be. There is only life. Our opinions and points of view are not a final truth. And then, taken from her book, but quoting somebody else, psychologist Susan Jeffers says, let go your picture of how you want it all to be. Let go trying to control things over which you have no control. When you give up needing it all to be a certain way, you can breathe a sigh of relief and open the next door. I have some reflection questions in mind that I can ask you to get you thinking. But before I do that, I would like to give you opportunities for comments, questions, observations, so that I'm not necessarily taking you somewhere where when you need to go somewhere else. So I think we're a small enough group that you can just unmute yourself and make a comment or a question or an observation, and we won't lose each other in the process. So I just invite that at this time.
Faith, I just want to thank you for this well-grounded conversation in grief and faith. Especially, I found powerful just in the very beginning, your definitions, especially around the 3 N's: normal, natural, and necessary. I've often found trying to find resources that center this and a faith conversation hard to find, because usually it's kind of like oh, but the resurrection, and skipping over grief, or but oh, we have these promises, and not realizing what's normal and natural. And the closest thing I found is a book by Megan Devine, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, but it's not from a Christian perspective, which people often say they're missing. And so, you know, if there's any resources you would pass on as good books or good things to share with our people, I'd love to hear it.
Thanks, Lindsay. You know, I've been collecting books on grief that some of which I haven't even begun to read yet, but I have this long list of books. And I have to say that the three little publications by Kenneth Hawk from the Stephen Ministries are very useful, just simple and straightforward and basic. But I've drawn on that when I've put together the workshop, which I draw from the Grief Recovery Institute, because I think the definitions are helpful, and the sort of taking away the myths. And one that I didn't include there, but you kind of alluded to, that we often might do in our Christian settings, is to say, oh, he's in a better place, she's in a better place, as if that makes us feel that we don't need to grieve. We're still dealing with the loss. We still need to grieve. And so sometimes our own Christian assumptions can get in the way of the acknowledgement that grief needs to take place. And I'll think a little more, Lindsay, about references, because I know that when I did this presentation for, not this presentation, but a workshop for a Presbyterian group, they were looking for titles. And so I went to my bibliography and I flagged ones that I thought might be especially useful for them. So I'll take a look at that again. And if it looks like it's been helpful, I can send it to Marla and she can send it out to the group that has been present today. Other comments or questions or observations?
Thank you, Faith. Over the past number of months, I've put together a grief support group here at Good Shepherd in Red Deer, realizing that over COVID, and all of the regulations that were involved in it, grief, in some cases, grief has been suspended. And by that, I mean for a congregation, the family that's involved, their grief is still quite palpable. But in some ways, because they're connected to a worshiping community and they've had no possibility of connecting with that community during a very hard and sacred time, they do have some need to be able to find a place to express that grief, to be able to say to each other, yeah, this was difficult, we're very sad, and we're sad with you. There was no place to do that, and for some of the families, there was no place to really speak. And so I find this very helpful, and I look forward to your bibliography that Marla will hopefully send out. Hi, Marla. But what I wanted to address too was the notion of long-term grieving. For instance, when you have a parent with a lingering dementia, and you watch them slowly lose their personality, their physical nature, and so forth, and that can function over a long and extended period of time. Can you speak about that at all?
I would say it's a prolonged experience of grief in itself that may or may not be acknowledged the way it needs to be, because some people might say, well, you still have that person here, and you do and you don't, right? And so to come back to that definition of the conflicting feelings, there's conflicting feelings, and maybe there's a feeling that I still have this person alive, but I don't have this person the way I knew this person, or I have all the good memories, but I can't identify and relate with the person right now. And do I have permission to grieve? You know, I think that we need to be, as support people, we need to hold them in that grief and to let them name it and feel it and not feel guilty. That's one of the words that comes up in the Grief Recovery Institute's material, that there's no place really, that they would say there's no place for guilt around grief, because there's nothing we've done to create the scenario. And yet there may be this sort of false burden of guilt that gets carried along, like I shouldn't be feeling this way or something like that, which doesn't give permission for the things that are actually being experienced. And I think that in a situation like that, it's a kind of complicated grief, and that's another terminology that gets used. There are some useful terminologies, and I'm still working through them myself. Complicated grief being one of them, where there's loss and not loss at the same time. Ambiguous loss is another one that gets used sometimes too, and anticipatory loss. So there's for maybe not that situation so much, but I can look at the fact that my parents are in their 80s and they're still in pretty good health, but I can imagine that a decade from now, that's not going to be true. And so there's some kind of anticipatory loss already taking place, even when they're here. And it might seem silly, but it's not silly because it's real. It's natural, and it's just part of who we are. So I think part of that, John, and maybe this is or isn't helpful, is just helping the people give themselves permission to feel what they're feeling and to be able to name that and to be supported in that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Faith.
Yeah. Other comments or questions, even about your own grief, as many of you, not all of you, but many of you are leaders of congregations, and what's that been like in terms of grief for yourself?
I'm not answering that question, but I do want to go back a little bit to like the change in funerals as a whole, where now we can't call them funerals, but we call them celebrations of life. Like that we can't acknowledge that there's grief attached to this whole thing, that it's a celebration of life, that this is the way mom or dad would have wanted it. They wouldn't want us crying. They wouldn't want us grieving, you know, that the whole thing is one great big celebration, which totally denies the losses that we're feeling. And I think that the whole idea of, you know, gathering in a memorial service or a funeral service gives that space for people to grieve appropriately and for the community to gather around people in their grieving, which again, during COVID, we haven't really been able to do in the same way. But the whole language is changing as if it's inappropriate now for us to grieve the loss of someone who has died. We can't even say they've died, you know, but all of that language is changing, right? And it says something about our culture, I think, and what we say about grief.
Yeah.
And even on this Easter Sunday coming up, you know, the comment was made, you know, about the music we choose, and we're tired now of dragging our feet, and it has to be happy, and it has to be peppy, and it has to be, you know, loud and laud and all of that. And that's great on an Easter Sunday. And yes, you know, the resurrection is about that. But when you look at the Easter Sunday Gospels, nobody's really at the point of joy. Everybody's still in confusion and grief and wondering and not really sure what to do. And it's not just the first week, it's the following week. We're hiding in this upper room and we don't know what to do with this news of the resurrection. You know, so it's confusing. And we don't allow ourselves the time to really say we don't know what it means to be a resurrected people, and to grieve and to say, yes, there is this life, but with this life, there's a whole lot of loss, and that Jesus enters in right in that space,
Yeah.
as you know, and takes that loss as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Those are all some very, very wise and true comments. And celebration of life, it comes back to one of those myths I said, don't feel bad. You know, we're sort of encouraged when someone dies not to feel bad. And it just, it robs us of the reality of the loss. And of acknowledging the conflicting feelings. Yes, we want to celebrate that person's life, but we want to grieve that that person is no longer here. And so what are we doing even in our rituals of grief if we're taking away some of the permission to feel? And that, you know, and I think you're right, there's something in our culture that has been contributing to that. And I think as caregivers, we need to be really sensitive to what else is going on. And sometimes maybe we need to name potential feelings so people can say, oh, permission, you know, to really feel that I'm feeling loss. It just reminds me, and this is not about death at all, but a number of years ago when I was talking to an acquaintance about so many of the things that I was missing in my life because of chronic illness, and because I had just been many years of my adult life, I wasn't really allowed to be productive in any particular way. And I was expressing this, and then this person just took words that I had not even said and said to me, so you're saying doing spiritual direction work is not enough? I hadn't said anything like that. I hadn't even mentioned spiritual direction. I'd just been conveying the losses I experienced, and that simple comment and response was taking away my permission to feel. And how, you know, just the need to be sensitive to conflicting feelings, because yes, I was glad I was doing some spiritual direction. I wanted to do more, but she hadn't heard anything I had said, really. And so how do we be good listeners for one another, and listening even to the things that aren't being said, because there may be not feeling there's a readiness for them to say it, or again, I use the word permission. What does the culture give permission for? And then what do we as caregivers give permission for to people? Other comments or observations or questions? I will say that, Brian, were you going to say something? You just muted yourself. You're muted, Brian.
Okay, there we go. Facebook and Zuckerberg have been getting a lot of negative attention lately. But I've been appreciative of Facebook and Zuckerberg during the pandemic, especially for the amount of social communication and friendship maintenance and growth and expansion and so on. And one element is related to grief, because every day Facebook faithfully reminds me of what I did 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and along with all the comments that came up in response to that. And so though I grieve Ruth Jensen's death still, she still makes my day because of what she said 3 years ago or 4 years ago. I mean, she was one I would always visit in Camrose, and now I can't do that, but it seems like she pops up on my screen with great regularity, and she's one of many. And as the years go by, I guess there'll be many more. But so I'm grateful for those well, memories. I think we're reluctant sometimes to bring up memories of those deceased with those who, the survivors who might still be grieving, and we're not sure just how to react. But I think Facebook does that without intruding, and like I say, it still makes my day to read those comments.
Mm. That's good. You know, one of the other things that happens is just the opposite, where I get invited to be someone's friend and that person died 5 years ago. And somehow the media, the social media is still generating that person's life out there. Or LinkedIn, you know, says, maybe you'd like to be connected with it. I'm thinking they don't live anymore. And so it can go the opposite direction too. And that can be unfortunate if it, you know, lands in somebody's inbox in the wrong day, in the wrong way.
I think it might make a difference that I live 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers away. Like, these people aren't people I would see every day.
Yeah.
So being far away, and even family connections. I mean, I grieve our parents' death much differently than Marlis does. I don't live around the corner and never have. So
Yeah, I think we lost Brian here for a moment, but well, I'm thanking you for your comments, all of you. I kind of encourage you to, you know, in some of your own time away from this session, to think of some of your losses during this pandemic, especially as those of you who are worship leaders, and that's a number of you here today, because in my spiritual direction work, there are clergy from different denominations who meet with me, and some of them are having you know, a lot of challenges, a lot of experience of loss about what it means to be in their role, you know, even as in some ways we're kind of coming out of some of it, but we're coming out of it differently than we went into it. And just to be able to acknowledge that for yourselves as well, and to do whatever kind of self-care will support you in that. I think it's really, really important too. And Larry, I'm conscious of the time, and so perhaps it's a good time for me to turn it back over to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Faith. This has been a very rich and engaging time, Faith. Thanks for your presentation. And thanks to each of you for your contribution in terms of comments or questions. Very much appreciated. Faith, thank you for providing a list of resources that you feel would be useful, and we certainly will get that out through the Synod office and Marla as well. Very conscious of the theme today, or the topic, given that it's Holy Week as well. And blessings to each of you as you gather in your various communities in various ways for Maundy Thursday tonight. Blessings to you as you lead, or as you help with the music, I'm supposing, Joanne, at your congregation, and sharing the gifts of you and the gifts with the community during this Holy Week. This will be the final Synod Connect until the fall. And within the next month or so, you'll be receiving, everyone who's participated in one or more over the past year and a half, a survey and evaluation piece to fill out. We'd like to get some feedback about Synod Connect and what your experience has been, and ideas for other themes or topics or presentations. So you can expect that in about a month's time or something like that. Also wanted to share before closing in prayer today that our Synod's Care Ministry team is offering a free learning event facilitated by Pastor Ann Zimmerman, who's with us today from Lakeland Lutheran in Cold Lake, and Pastor Doug Heine, who's retired and living in Edson, offering materials, tools, and strategies to cope with grief and stress experienced during this COVID-19 pandemic. And that begins on April the 21st, which is next Thursday at 7 p.m. and it goes for 4 consecutive Thursdays. If you're interested, please sign up. You would have received, if you received Wednesday's Word, MailChimp earlier this week that has information. But please share this with those in your communities of faith or families or wherever you can if there's an interest in this. And this will be 4 consecutive Thursdays, beginning next Thursday at 7 p.m. Thank you to each of you for your participation, your presence today. Again, Faith, thank you to you. I know this is a very busy day and busy few days for all of us, so thank you for this time together. I want to conclude our time with the prayer that's been coming out each day from the Lutheran World Federation and the prayer for Holy Thursday. So let us pray. Eternal God, in the sharing of a meal, your Son established a new covenant for all people. And in the washing of feet, he showed us the dignity of service. Renew the power of this mystery in our service to one another and to you. Amen. Blessings, dear friends, for the rest of the day and these holy days of Lent, as you come to new life and promise as we celebrate the resurrection together. Blessings. Bye-bye. Thanks, Faith.